Hi guys, and welcome back to Pass and Move. And for today's episode in our Premier League series, we've got the 19th, second last team in the Premier League in terms of the alphabetical order, of course, West Brom. Very interesting team to take on, and we'll talk more about that. But just to give you a general idea, tactics and team guide is really just about the name, really. So we'll be talking about and trying to help you set up the best tactics to really, well, get the best out of this West Brom team and hopefully go a step further than your expectations that are, your own expectations and the board expectations. And then obviously team guide is just more about who to sell, who you should keep, players that you might want to build a team around, areas that you might need to invest in to try and get your squad better. So those sort of general tips that we'll be covering, and obviously some of these tabs we'll just skim through quite quickly. But in terms of West Brom and their history and why you might want to take over them, they are an interesting team, just like every team in the Premier League really. But yeah, they've been sort of up and down in the Premier League, and of late they've sort of solidified themselves as a mid-table team. But you do really want to take them that step further and build some history with them. So in terms of their own history, they've got a single English Premier League title to their name, which was back in 1920. So you do want to make history and win the next one. Really, if you could aim for 2020, that would be incredible as well. Every 100 years you win a Premier League title. And they do have a decent number of FA Cups here, a respectable amount, but obviously very old FA Cups as well. So you do want to add some cup competitions to your name. The League Cup was in 66 as well. Community Shield 1920, 54 as well. 2008 was a Sky Bet Championship, and that's kind of it. So they really lack some silverware, which is why you could build some more history with them. They're not necessarily as low as some relegation candidates who you might want to try and build up. Instead, you've got sort of a solid foundation with West Brom. Although I think expectations are a little bit high for this West Brom team, we'll have a look at the squad and see more about that. But I think you are definitely a mid-table team, and if you do, exceed expectations just a little bit, if you do the right things at the right times, you could just about squeeze into Europa League football. And obviously that would be incredible, getting that European money. So in terms of expectations from the board themselves, we'll cover that quickly. They think you should be a mid-table team, so they're not aiming for too high. It should be doable with the squad. We'll have a talk about the squad itself a little bit more, but yeah, mid-table, fifth round in the FA Cup, and you enter in the third round. That should definitely be doable. And the League Cup, second round, and you enter the fourth. Now I always mention it in all my videos, but I'll say it again for any sort of somewhat, so-called smaller teams. The FA Cup and League Cup, do not take them lightly. In particular, the League Cup, people tend to do that. If you do win either of these competitions, you get Europa League football, and so if you ask me, the League Cup was obviously a little bit more realistic, so you should try and take this competition a bit more seriously than you would the FA Cup, because you're a bit more likely, of course, to get a trophy. You get your hands on this trophy than the FA Cup, where maybe teams set themselves up a bit more attacking and are willing to take the risk, basically. So that's kind of it in terms of the competitions. One of the first things I like to do after I've obviously had a general look at everything is actually sort out my staff. So you could do some improvement. It looks like your coaching team's not too bad, but your scouting in particular is really poor, and your physios could do some work, especially because there's so many good physios around. I never understand, even when small teams have bad physios, there's always a bunch of free agents that have physiotherapy of 20 in terms of their attributes, so you could easily get those and sort out your physios. But yeah, I go to staff, I go to coaching team. Obviously I actually sort them out, but we're going to work with what we've got here today, and I sort them out in terms of their judgment of ability. Just try and find which coaching staff's opinion I can trust most on their judgment of my own players' ability, to see who I should really truly be building my team around. So it looks like Mark Harrison, the head of youth development, which is a good coach or staff member to trust. He's got judging ability of 16 and judging potential of 17, and so you could really trust him and know that he is doing his job well. Ben Garner's another decent shout, but Mark Harrison's the coach that we're going to trust. So keeping that in mind, we'll go to the under-23s as well. Have a quick look. I think I already did this. Maybe I didn't. But quick look at the under-23s and under-18s and just see if there's anyone who's ready for the first team squad. So by the looks of it, the best in terms of ability are Sky Bet League 1 players, and they're all out on loan. Mark Flint is the closest one, but he's a Vanarama national football ability, so he's nowhere near first team action. The next thing to do is actually sort them out by age and see if there's anyone over the age of 23 who shouldn't be here. So thankfully West Brom don't have that. You don't need to promote anyone to the first team and sort of sell them off or see if they need to be there or not. But anyways, that means we can finally move on to the main squad. So, well, apparently we've got a couple of old age players. So we'll just have a quick look at the team report actually. So overall depth is an issue, which is what you'd expect with a mid-table team or some, so-called smaller team. Passing is a bit of an issue apparently. First touch, leadership, aggression, work rate, decision making, and some staff issues too. But the good thing is you've got some good jumping reach, midfield depth, youth prospects, defensive depth, goalkeeper. I feel like these things are quite, yeah, they do make sense. Alright, well anyways, so it looks like depth is already an issue, but we'll go through each squad member one by one, and while we'll do that, we'll actually try and figure out who we should be building the team around. So just to give you an idea, you could quickly sort them out in terms of ability like this and try and squeeze in the best 11. I feel like that's what I like to do when I first join a team. Just see the best 11 players at the squad. You can sort it out like this and trust your assistant manager. You can go through them one by one. I've already done this, which is why I'll explain in just a second. I'll go through them one by one, and I feel like West Brom should be aiming for an ability, or a minimum ability in terms of their players, of a good player for most Premier League sides, especially because you're a mid-table team. You should have those type of quality players and eventually build up to a leading and star and world-class players, of course. But for now, having that minimum of good players, good player abilities, and then building the squad on the basis of them, you just try and squeeze in the best 11 players as much as possible. It's very rare that you're actually able to squeeze all 11 players in the same starting 11, build a formation out of them. But sometimes it does happen. With West Brom, I've found that the 4-1-4-1 or the 4-3-3 actually it suits the team a lot as well. We have, like it said, a lot of midfield depth, so it just made sense to capitalize on that, and we'll be going with that as well. We have a single striker who's the best apparently, and that's Solomon Rondon, and we'll be trying to get the best out of him as well. So a 4-3-3 made sense. But just to give you an idea, you should be going through each individual player, which we'll be doing, but I just needed to tell you that for a reason. But yeah, you should go through each individual player and try and see who has the best ability, marking them down, because not necessarily just sorting out like this means these are the best 11. You might find someone better, and that the assistant coach is just getting it wrong. We said we're trusting Mark Harrison, so this is a championship player, and James McLean, that gives us an idea. For example, Craig Dawson, just a decent player. You won't necessarily want to build around him, so you might not want to really consider him out of the 11, and so on and so forth. But yeah, having done this already, I've noticed that the 4-3-3, like we mentioned, is the best formation for this squad. So bearing that in mind, we can now actually go through each individual member and see whether we have the correct numbers and the correct quality in each position. And I like to have a squad of 22 players, starting 11 of leading star or world-class players, and a backup 11 of youngsters who have potential to become star, leading, world-class players, who are obviously ready for the division, because I feel like that's very important. A lot of people go like, yeah, I have a bunch of youngsters coming through, they're in the first team, giving them some game time, but really they're just championship players or Sky Bet League 1 players. I mean, do whatever you're comfortable with, but for me, everyone in my squad, whether they're a starter or backup player, has to be ready at least for the Premier League division. He doesn't have to be a top player. He can be a decent player for most Premier League sides, a youngster, decent player for most Premier League sides, who has potential, and that way, that's someone I know I could trust. But anyways, you've got 23 people, so it's good to see you're one number over. The question is, do you have the right numbers in the right areas? And are we missing some players in some positions? So knowing the formation and knowing the squad numbers, we can actually go in through each individual position and see whether we've got the numbers there and whether we've got the quality, and like I mentioned, 2 players per position, and the perfect balance to strike is a prime player, leading player for most Premier League sides, star or world class, and then the backup youngster who's happy to not be getting too much game time. He's just trying to fight his way into the first team, and that keeps the starting 11 player on his toes. So anyways, you've got 2 goalkeepers, and that's exactly what you want in terms of numbers, but it looks like you've only really got Ben Foster, who you could trust. He's a good player for most Premier League sides. I think he's an England international, 8 caps to his name. Problem is he's 34 years of age. But for goalkeepers, that's kind of, normal, I suppose. He should last you a couple more seasons. 60k wages might be a little bit high, But yeah, Ben Foster, definitely a player of quality and your first team starting 11 goalkeeper, so we'll put him in that side there. His backup though, Boaz, is not good enough. A championship player, also quite old, 34 years of age. Boaz Mihil, anyways, Welsh international. He seems to be a decent player since, you know, he does have experience and international caps to his name and whatnot, but the problem is, yeah, just a championship player, 34 years of age, 25.5k wages for a backup player who's not really ever going to feature for your first team unless Ben Foster's injured. It doesn't really make sense to actually have this player on your squad. So if you ask me, try and move him on and bring in a youngster with potential who can eventually overtake Ben Foster and can learn from Ben Foster. Ben Foster should be able to tutor him. Just like to say before we actually move on to the next position is that you should always invest in buying players first and then selling whoever you didn't want off after. You don't want to sell, for example, Boaz here, get your 2.2 million if you do sell him for his value, and then you try and find a goalkeeper and you find that maybe there's no one necessarily suited to your squad, or maybe you do buy someone and then, you know, the contract falls through, or the player changes his mind, someone else comes for him instead, and suddenly you're short of numbers and you only got one goalkeeper. And then what happens if Ben Foster's injured? So it's much more secure to sell a player, to buy a player first and then sell the player you don't need. And also bear in mind, even if you do sell the player for 2.2 million, some boards or clubs keep some of that money, so you might only get half of this, and that money that you're relying on is suddenly not in your hands. So I feel like it's always wiser to buy first, or even loan in first before you actually sell the player that you don't need anymore in your squad. But obviously, if you ask me, you should always try and buy. You don't want to rely on loan players. It's sort of a last gasp sort of thing. You want to avoid as much as possible because you want your own players to actually be your own players, not loan players. But anyways, so yeah, that's just my advice. A lot of people do it differently. Some people feel like the player that they're going in for is definitely theirs, so they're very confident and can sell the players off. I'll admit I've done that a few times, but it is a very risky transfer strategy. But anyways, that's goalkeeper. So in terms of right backs, it looks like you've only got Alan Nyom, the Cameroonian. We'll have a quick look at these other players here, but the likelihood is that they are only just centre backs. Craig Dawson's a capable right back by the looks of it. But we do need the numbers in the centre of defence. So, do any of you play in centre back? No. How about right wingers who are actually fullbacks? Nope. Alright, was that Jake Livermore? But we don't really want him in centre of defence, do we? Oh, he can actually do a decent job there, to be fair. And then that would mean you could... It is an option. You could move Craig Dawson. I think Allen is a decent player for most Premier League sides, so you do want to build on better for that, but at least he is a Premier League player. And so I don't feel like there's any necessary need to move Craig Dawson to a right back spot. He is definitely better as a central defender. His attributes suit him best, and I feel like if you squeeze him out wide, he doesn't necessarily have that attacking, you know, like dribbling, for example, off the ball movement. I think he's got actually decent crossing, to be fair. His other attributes seem to be quite good, but really attacking wise, he might let you down a bit. He would definitely be able to do a job there if needed, but let's keep that versatility to itself. So you've only got one right back, Allen there, and he's a decent player for most Premier League sides. You definitely need the backup. So before you even consider bringing in another goalkeeper for Boaz, you actually have to consider the areas where you don't have numbers, where you don't have positions, you know, backup players and whatnot. So right back is a top priority so far. There probably is other positions that we'll look at and we'll see, but at least right back we don't have the numbers. And Allen is a decent player for most Premier League sides, but you do want to build on him. Try and get in an actual. He's expecting first team football, but if you do bring in a better quality player, he'll understand him being dropped to rotation football. If he doesn't, you can sell him off. You know, he'll ask to leave and whatnot, and you can probably just bring in a youngster with potential. But most players, they can recognize when there's someone else who's better than them, and they kind of, you know, shut up basically. But yeah, 29 years of age, peak age, 35k is not too much, to be honest. He's actually a decent right back, but in truth, you do want to get better. Like we mentioned, we want to set a benchmark of a minimum of good player for most Premier League sides, so we really you know, become that we really solidify the mid-table position, and then we can build on that to become, you know, Europa League football, and then you know, Champions League football, and then possibly champions, title winners. But yeah, it's a very gradual progress. But at least Nyom is a Premier League player. You have basically two options really. You could, if you can find someone that you can actually invest in, a good right back, good player for most Premier League sides, then do that. If there's no real options, or there's too many expensive options, for example, then you can definitely just bring in a youngster potential, someone ready for Premier League and who can eventually overtake Nyom as well. But yeah, right back is needed, so keep that in mind. Central defenders, in terms of the looks of it here, you've got 4 of them. In terms of ability, Johnny Evans is gonna, you know what, sorry about that, but just for a second we'll just put Nyom as the right back. So Johnny Evans is clearly your best centre-back, a leading player for most Premier League sides, which actually kind of shocked me. I thought he was just a good player, but I guess his good form has counted for something, and he's become a leading player for most Premier League sides. So he's your starting 11 centre-back. Gareth Macaulay is a decent player for most Premier League sides. His weakest area of the game is slow player, so you do want to try and protect him as much as possible and do not partner him with another slow centre-back. Hegazi is a lone player, championship player, and he's unlikely to improve by the looks of it. 26 years of age as well, that makes sense. You cannot terminate his loan, so it looks like you're stuck with him for the season, but if you ask me, not good enough of course to be in your squad, so it's a bit of an area of concern. Trying to avoid using him as much as possible, because you do have Craig Dawson, who's also another decent player for most Premier League sides. The good thing is you've got 4 players, and if you ask me, it should actually be Johnny Evans and Craig Dawson. You want to avoid using Gareth Macaulay. He's happy with rotational football anyways. Craig Dawson I think was expecting first team football. Hegazi, what are you expecting? He's expecting first team football for some reason. He's only on 2.5k wages to be fair, so that's not too much. But if you ask me, he's a backup player at best, a player that you should avoid using by any means necessary. Johnny Evans is just out for 4 weeks to 2 months, so he should be back within Premier League football time. Gareth Macaulay, 2 to 3 months. You should be able to survive without him. I don't think it's necessary for you to bring in a lone player. If you really do feel that you're short in options, then maybe you can bring in a lone player until winter time. But Gareth McCauley, you're right. But in terms of building, obviously Hegazi should be replaced as soon as possible, and then obviously you can eventually get rid of Craig Dawson and Gareth McCauley and try and find a good player for most Premier League sides and possibly better backup players, because your first team option, the only real one, is Johnny Evans. In terms of left backs, it looks like you've only got Kieran Gibbs. We looked at the other players. There's no one necessarily who's comfortable to be a left back. I wouldn't imagine anyone here, so it looks like again your fullback positions are short. So Gibbs is your only one. He's a good player for most Premier League sides, definitely good enough for the first team, but yeah, you should bring in a backup youngster with potential who can eventually overtake Kieran Gibbs. The other option is obviously if you find the leading player, leading fullback that you can bring in, definitely do that. But I think you just brought Gibbs in, so maybe you wouldn't necessarily want to upset him. 55k is not too much for a first team player in truth. He is a very decent option for you, English player as well, international, and I feel like you've got a solid player in Gibbs. You're better off possibly just, if you ask him for my advice, bringing a youngster with potential. But yeah, fullbacks so far are the areas to invest in. So that brings us to central midfielders. Looks like we've got plenty: Gareth Barry, Claudio Jacob, Sam Field, Greg Kriwowicz. Let's just call him Greg. That's 4 defensive midfielders. You've got Jake Livermore here as well, James Morrison, and the rest seem to be wingers, but maybe sometimes wingers can play in central midfield. I don't think any of the ones you've got currently do that. James McLean, Tavon Campbell. Alright, that seems to be about it. So you've got the perfect numbers, which is 6. The problem is that a lot of them are defensive midfielders. We're going to try and squeeze the best 3 in together. The good news is though that a lot of these defensive midfielders can actually play in central midfield, so we might just about be okay. So let's go through them one by one. Gareth Barry is a decent player for most Premier League sides. Quite old at 36 years of age, but he is an English international. He's expecting first team football, which is a bit of an issue. But obviously his personality, his experience could be vital for the team. If you ask me, you're paying a bit too much for him in 60k wages, but his attributes are really good. But I don't think he's a starting 11 player, so you might want to demote his squad status. Claudio Jacob is the definite defensive midfielder, good player for most Premier League sides, a first teamer. That's the type of player we're looking for. And Sam Field is just a championship player, so you've got the numbers, but quality is a little bit lacking in terms of your backup players. And Sam Field and Gareth Barry do not represent the ideal backup player. Sam Field, if he was a Premier League player, he'd be the perfect one because he's 19 years of age, he's happy to learn from other senior players, and he can eventually become a top player. But for now, if you ask me, you should loan him out. Only obviously when you actually bring in someone else. Greg here is a good player for most Premier League sides. The problem is that he's only on loan. Let's have a look if you can actually buy him. There's no real future value. He's on loan from PSG, but you've got him for the season at least. You might as well make use of him, and we can include him in the first team as well. That leaves us with Jake Livermore, who's a good player for most Premier League sides as well, and James Morrison, who's also a good player for most Premier League sides. So in fact, you do have quite a bit of depth, as it said, in midfield. So your midfield is your strongest area, which is why we're trying to play as much players as possible together. And if you ask me, James Morrison's out for 4 weeks to 2 months. So it's okay. We have to keep in mind that considering Jacob and Greg are both, seem to be at least more defensive players. Let's have a serious look at them. It would make a little bit more sense to actually play. You know what? I think Livermore should be a central midfielder instead of Greg. Greg is expecting first team football and he is a quality player, but he's apparently more of a defensive midfielder. And since he's on loan, I feel like we have to trust our own players a bit more. So we're going to give Jake Livermore the football that he's expecting, and he's our own player. So you have to, I guess, trust him or give him a little bit more faith. James Morrison is an attacking midfielder, but he's comfortable playing midfield, and he seems to be our most attacking capable midfielder, so we'll also be playing in midfield, and that way you have Greg, Gareth Barry and Sam Field as your backups. And Greg is a perfect backup to have. The problem is he's not really happy with being a backup player. Sam Field's not good enough quality. Gareth Barry's a decent backup, but you do want to improve on him. 1.5 million. His contract ends in the end of the season anyways, so you could give him a season's worth of football. And the truth is, you won't be able to get rid of him anyways because West Brom just brought him in. So yeah, I think just let him survive for a season and then just invest in a better player. So that's your midfield sorted out. At least you got the numbers there, so the priority still is right back and left back, and then you can start to look to invest in other areas of the squad where you need the better quality. But first you have to address the short numbers that you've got. Phillips, Oliver Burke, Chris Brunt, James McLean, Tavon Campbell, Robson Kanu, Jay Rodriguez, Nasser Chadli, and I feel like Salomon Rondon has to be included. Now you're playing with a front three of 2 wingers and a striker, so that means you should have 6 players. You've got 9, and this is where you can make some serious money to invest in your right back and left back, and obviously in other areas of the squad. But first the right back and left backs, because you're short of numbers. You need 6 and you've got 9, so 3 players are definitely going, and the question is who. By the looks of it, Tavon Campbell is not good enough at all, a national player, so you can actually move him on. We can consider him out of the equation. It looks like Oliver Burke, maybe just a championship player as well. He'd do decent with a season to know. He might come back to you as a Premier League player. Matt Phillips, decent player for most Premier League sides. Chris Brunt, good player. James McLean, championship player. Robson Kanu, championship player. Jay Rodriguez, decent player. Nasser Chadli, good player, and Salomon Rondon, definitely a good player as well. So you want to basically, by the looks of it, you want to squeeze in Chris Brunt, Nasser Chadli, and Salomon Rondon together, because they are the 3 players who are good players for most Premier League sides. Now that leaves you with there's 7 players in total, so you still do have 1 extra, but that leaves you with these players here: Matt Phillips, James McLean, Robson Kanu, and Jay Rodriguez. And by the looks of it, only Matt Phillips and Jay Rodriguez are okay backups. They're decent play for most Premier League sides. You'd be better off without someone like Matt Phillips, to be honest, because he is susceptible to injuries. But at least, yeah, you do have a winger here. That's 1 position sorted, and then you do have Jay Rodriguez, 1 position sorted as well. The problem is that Rondon doesn't have a backup striker, and so you maybe want to play Robson Kanu, who apparently is okay playing a target man, but if you ask me, heading's not good enough. Some of these attributes aren't good enough. He might be actually better off playing out wide. James McLean, you might want to actually play Jay Rodriguez as a striker instead. You can definitely play as a winger, but we do need a backup to Rondon, and Jay Rodriguez seems to make the most sense. He's expecting first team football. 60k wages is a lot for just a decent player for most Premier League sides. English international with just a single cap to his name, but really he's expecting a bit too much out of this West Brom side. So he should be a backup to Solomon Rondon, if you ask me. And that leaves the left wing position open. And so you can give that to either Robson Kanu or McLean. And if you ask me, McLean seems to edge him just a little bit. Leading player for most Premier League Championship sides, and he's just a good player for. So to be honest, Robson Kanu should be moving on as well. He's come in on a free last season, but he's nowhere near good enough in terms of quality. And he's just the most dispensable player. So if you do sell him, that's 10 million in the bank extra to your transfer budget. Hopefully the board give you all that money, and you've got some decent backups. But again, you do want to improve the overall the depth of the squad, but you do want to address key areas, right? The right back and left back spots, which in particular need backup players. So now that we know our first team 11, we can actually have a look at the tactics. So this is your starting 11 players. Obviously, Johnny Evans and James Morrison still need to return from injury. But this is the formation that we're going to be playing with, and the tactics rather. So we're going to be going with a possession style of football. So a lot of people think possession, I've always mentioned this in my videos, but a lot of people think possession is tiki-taka, risky play, and you know, all this sort of beautiful things going on in football, this pass and move sort of thing. But possession football is a lot different than that in truth. So possession football, you want to avoid players who dribble a lot, who take a lot of shots, who cross a lot. You know, you want to work the ball into the box. So someone crossing is just playing too direct, and dribbling's too direct as well. And what else do you mention? Shots as well as too direct, because we want, like we mentioned, working the ball into the box. So this is kind of what we're forced sort of to go into with the players with quality that we've got. We can adjust the roles to Dawson as a defensive centre-back, but I feel like he's got the mental attributes to play as a central defender. His decision-making is a bit of a worry, but otherwise it's okay. But let's just play him as what he's comfortable in. Evans is a ball-playing defender as well. I think he's very capable in that role. It wouldn't do any harm to play him there. But otherwise, this is kind of what you want to go with. I think you can move Chadley to the other side actually. So this is where you have a bit of decision to make. In truth, I was actually considering the 4-1-4-1 and playing inverted wingers with Brunt and Chadley, but unfortunately, you know, we could do that. Brunt can play as an inverted winger. He's got some decent attributes. He doesn't have the pace needed. It does cut inside from both wings, which helps us. But I feel like we have to bear in mind what we're working to eventually, and I'll show you that in just a second. I'll explain the position. But yeah, you could definitely, if you don't like how this looks, you can definitely play Brunt and Chadley as inside wingers, inverted wingers. And that would also protect you a little bit better playing a 4-1-4-1 against top teams. But this is kind of what we've gone for. You've got already sorted out the back line. So if you're playing an advanced playmaker in Brunt, he's capable, he's got the vision for it, he's natural there, and he prefers the advanced playmaker role, and it doesn't mean that he has to use too much pace. Cuts inside from both wings as well. Chadley's naturally an inside forward, either footed, but I feel like having him focus a bit more on attacking, you know, his finishing first touch is good, his mental attributes are decent, physicals are quite decent as well. He's a little bit more suited to the inside forward if you ask me, but I feel like we can get more goals out of him by using him in the Rodamantora role. A hint uncomfortable with it. So if he doesn't play too well for you playing in that position, you can definitely play him as an inside forward, in that role, sorry. Then you could definitely play him as an inside forward instead. But we can't have him on the left wing because that's where we have Chris Brunt. I think his name was it Chris? Yes. You can obviously play Chris Brunt out of position himself as well. But I feel like this just sort of works best. You could definitely switch around the advanced playmaker and Chadley and whatnot, but I feel like Gibbs is a better wing back. Nyom's a bit too defensive, so it makes sense playing him as a fullback on support, where we don't have to rely too much on his crossing. Concentration is a bit of a worry, but we definitely cannot afford to play defensive fullback anyways. So it's just to protect these players kind of thing. You've got Jacob as a defensive midfielder on defend. He's most comfortable in anyways. Acceleration is a bit of a worry, but otherwise he's got very good attributes for the role, and he should do a decent job for us there. We've got Livermore as a Carriello, which is his most comfortable in. You can definitely play him as a box-to-box midfielder or Mesler, but I feel like his finishing and long shots is a bit of a concern. But he can do the job, and box-to-box midfield is the same thing, finishing and long shots anyways. Carriello, though, seems to suit him best and his most natural role, I suppose. So we'll be playing him there. Carriellos are you know, they're used to being a midfield 3 anyway, so we'll be playing him there. Morrison, typically an advanced playmaker, but he can definitely do the Mesler role. The issue is his bravery and strength, but otherwise I sort of have a rule of thumb that if you've got 3 attributes that are a little bit lower than 12, then you can get away with it in the Premier League. So bravery and strength are just 2, everything else is above 12, and so you should be able to do that Meza role quite well. We don't need advanced playmaker on attack. We need someone who can really partner or go well with Rondon, who's playing as a target man. Now I know you're thinking, possession football, why on earth are you playing a target man? But the truth is, it brings out the best out of Solomon Rondon. We're playing him on attack duty as well to bring out the best out of his finishing. I'd love to play him in a different role, but the truth is it's just not as good enough. He can play the complete forward role, but he's lacking in some areas. Advanced forward might be a bit of a decent shout, but I want to get as much as possible out of Solomon Rondon, and so we've gone with target man. And there's a couple of things that you can amend for that. Bear in mind, it's all about preferences. Like I mentioned, you could play with inverted wingers instead. You could move Brunt to the right side and Chadley to the left, all that sort of business. But yeah, this I feel like brings out the best out of the squad. So in terms of the instructions and whatnot, mentality has to be counter. You are playing possession football, which means you're playing a low risk strategy, and so counter comes in mind. You can definitely go with defensive when you're playing bigger teams or whatever, but counter, I like counter because you can actually counter on the ball. Of course, defensive doesn't do that as much, but 2 of these are low risk strategies and they suit the possession football. Now in terms of team shape, everyone has their own understanding, but for me, I like to play structured because obviously I like to give a structured shape to my team. But at the same time, I'm the type of manager that doesn't like too many team instructions, and so I feel like structured means that everyone plays according to what their role tells them, and each individual does their each individual job. Whereas when you play fluid, you can literally see the whole team attacking and defending together. Now that's good in certain circumstances, but I'm just not a fan of it. And I feel like because they attack and defend together, since they do everything as a team, then having a bunch of team instructions would make sense. And so I feel like if you do play fluid, it would make more sense to have a bunch of team instructions. But since I don't like a lot, then it makes sense for me to go structured. So just shorter passing. You definitely have the option of keeping it on mix and go with retained possession as well, but I'm just not a fan of retained possession because I feel like it means the players keep the ball for no necessary reason. And so I rather play shorter passing where they might be a bit more riskier. But if you ask me, since we are playing a target man, it might be a bit smarter to play retained possession, so that way your players aren't just lumping the ball forward. But again, see what works with you and what your preferences are. In terms of what you want to eventually build towards, like I mentioned, so this is the ideal 4-3-3 formation, possession football. So what you're looking for really are, like I mentioned, players that don't dribble, players that don't cross, and players who don't shoot a lot. So that's why we've got a false 9. He's a lone striker. You could definitely go with the deep lying forward, possibly. Complete forward dribbles too much to my liking. A defensive forward on support might be a decent shout too, but we don't want necessarily anyone chasing the ball too much. Trequartista might suit you, but dribbles more, so that's again why we've just gone with the false 9. Just simple instructions of more risky passes and moving into the channels. Obviously I like the false 9 as well because he is the lone striker and we are playing just a single striker, and false 9 seems to make the most sense out of that. Advanced playmaker and Rodomantor is what we're eventually building towards, which is why I'm trying to play Brunt and Chadley in those roles. They might not be the most natural roles, but it does suit the overall tactic more, and that's why we kind of, sort of forced it, sort of just wedged them in there. But definitely they can, for example, Chris Brunt playing as a wide midfielder does us nothing. Cuts inside from both wings anyways, so an inverted wing or advanced playmaker might make sense anyways. Chadley inside forward, crosses less but still dribbles too much to our liking, and so that's why we're just playing him as a Rodomantor, and since he's either footed, he can play on the right wing in comparison to Brunt, who's just left footed. But yeah, like I mentioned again in the first tactic, you definitely just move them down into inverted wingers. We've got a Mesler on the right on attacking duty to support Chadley, both attacking. I like to have attacking duties together and support duties together. Got box to box midfielders, since they just go up and down, they roam from position, which is fine with us. We don't mind roaming players, we don't mind risky passing players. You could definitely have very structured players that don't roam. You can definitely have players who play safe passing, But for me, I just like to have, for the tactic you go either way, but we just want to avoid actual players who dribble and shoot and all that sort of business. We're looking for crosses from the byline, so we've gone with a wing back on attack instead with Kieran Gibbs, and we've gone with a complete wing back on support. They do dribble more, which is a bit of a concern. The same can be said with wing backs, but we are looking for crosses from byline once more, and Rodomators and advanced playmakers don't do that, and this should support the team all better. Central defender pairings seem decent. You can definitely go with the ball-playing defender if you prefer it. There are, in the modern football, there's a lot of ball-playing defenders, and the FM18 seems to have a lot of youngsters who are ball-playing defenders, so you could definitely do that, but I've just gone with standard 2 central defenders. Goalkeeper as well, normal. Mesler again to complement the false 9. And that's kind of it, so everything should sort of just go into each other. Don't worry too much about these squares, it's just because some of these players are uncomfortable in those roles. It should eventually turn into green just about everywhere. You've got some areas covered, and you should be okay. But yeah, and the instructions and the tactics stay the same, and that's kind of it. It's just the roles that change, and as you can see, there is a bit of a difference, of course. So I think we've covered just about everything that's important. We can quickly go through some other things just before, because this video is going on for too long if you ask me. I don't like 30-minute videos, but that's what always happens when I do tactics and team instructions and guides and whatnot. But anyways, staff, like we mentioned, you do want to sort them out as much as possible. Training, I like to have it on balanced and high during preseason, and average and balanced during the season itself. Match tactics always throughout preseason. When the season starts, I just go with whatever my scout tells me. Schedule, you've got a decent set of friendlies here, but you do want to improve in some quality, like Wrexham and Eastleigh. You don't want to play those. You do want to have, like, if you ask me, the best balance is having 6 friendlies, 3 at home, 3 away on tour, and that way you can get some merchandise if you're playing in China, for example. Competition expectations we already covered. Scouting system's been entirely revamped. If you ask me, it should always be your chief scout who's doing the scouting responsibility, but it looks like you don't have one, so director of football's taken on. And if you ask me, any Premier League team should have world packages for both senior and youth ones. You certainly got the money for it too if you wanted to, and you can increase the scouting budget as well a little bit if necessary. Transfers, no ins or outs, so that's good to see. Maybe some ins would have been nice, but at least there's no outs, no one necessarily trying to leave. We talked about the club history already, but very generally, Wolves and Aston Villa are your rivals, but we won't play them in any competitions. It looks like your only rival is Stoke. Wolves and Aston Villa maybe in cup competitions, but not Premier League. Stoke are the only Premier League opposition. Facilities, you've got decent ones. Average corporate facilities, we don't really care about those. We care more about data analysis, youth facilities, and training, and all of those are very good. Junior coaching and youth recruitment could do some work. Obviously, the facilities can improve as well, but for a mid-table team, you're very strong in that department as well. History mentioned already, and the board, in terms of the transfer budget, you've got about 100 wages more like, or a little less than 100, and 25 million in the budget. But if you ask me, I like to have it in the middle, leaning a little bit towards the transfer budget, so it's more like 15 million, and about 215 wages, and that seems to be a decent amount. You should be able to get 2 left backs with this kind of money, especially if you sell off Robson Canu as well and some of those excess players, and you should be able to do a decent amount with that. But yeah, 25 million is what the board's given you, but you do have to bear in mind finances. So you've got 25 million to spend, but you've only got 13 million in the bank. So if you do spend all that 25 million, you are going to be in the red, so that's a bit of an area of concern. In terms of debts and loans, you've got none, which is perfect for you. Just stay in the Premier League, keep performing well, get into European football, and you should make a ton of money. And as it says here, your financial status is secure, and it's good to see that your balance improves, and you've got a bunch of greens here. Turnover seems to be a bit of a concern, but really when it drops, it's just 161 million anyways. Your profit might be a bit of a worry, but again, you should be okay. Transfer budget keeps improving, and that's also good to see, but again, keep in mind the balance. Under 23s, youth players to look out for possibly. You do have a few in the first team squad that we mentioned. If you give them, championship players, if you send them out on loan, normally they come back to you Premier League ready within a season. But you do have to be very careful about where you send them out on loan. So, from about Mark Flint to about Tyler Roberts is the players to look out for, if you ask me. In terms of the players who can slot into your team easily, not really. You've got a bunch of wingers here, and that's not what we're trying to play with. Mark Flinton's a poacher as well, and Kane Wilson's a defensive fullback. So all of these youngsters don't necessarily suit your tactics, so you might want to consider, if they are top players, rebuilding your tactics towards something else rather than possession football. You can definitely play a very direct style of football with these players. And you know, I've just realised Mark Flint is a regen. I think it's because I have that add players to playable teams sort of thing. So maybe you might not actually have Mark Flint in your save, but some of these youngsters you should have. Either way, it looks like the youngsters are coming through as suited to direct style football, so you could consider changing your tactics, but like we mentioned, it's all down to you. So there you go, we've covered everything, tactics and team guide. Hopefully we've set you up for as much success as possible. And yeah, if any of these teams are yours, we definitely already covered them. There's only West Ham left, which will be coming up tomorrow. But for today, if you did enjoy the episode, then please do hit the like button and subscribe for more Daily Football Manager content. And of course, you know, leave your comments and all that sort of business. Once again, as always, thank you guys all very much for watching.